Language and its use is very important for cultural anthropologists, and if you'll remember, one of the subfields is linguistic anthropology, so obviously language, how it's used, how it's structured, how it shapes culture, are all going to be very important to linguistic anthropologists as well. I don't want to dive too deep into a ton of linguistic anthropology because it is a separate subfield, and this course focuses on cultural anthropology. But we talk about language in this class because language is really, really important to understanding culture and understanding how humans see their world and express themselves. So we like to use language or talk about language in cultural anthropology classes for that reason. It also can help you when you're working with a community to understand the language, not only just to be able to communicate, but understand the way language functions in the community or in the culture. And that can help you gather accurate information, really get to know the people and understand why they are doing things the way they are or saying things the way they are. So language is really important, not just for linguistic anthropologists, but for cultural anthropologists. So that's a little bit about why we're talking about language in a cultural anthropology class, because sometimes that is confusing to students, but really it's just because it's very useful for us in terms of helping us understand a culture and working within a culture. And then because culture and language are so integrated and so closely related, they help us understand each other. It works together. So it's important to understand both. Because when we start to talk about language, we start thinking about how, like we've talked about, everything in our culture feels very natural, when in fact it's actually artificial. So language is the same way. Every word that I'm saying or that you have ever said is arbitrary. It seems like it naturally is related to the object or the idea you're speaking about, but that's not really the case, right? So language is arbitrary, and that's a key component of it because that helps separate human language from non-human animal communication. So language is arbitrary and it's symbolic. So we use these symbols to stand for other things. And that's another key component of human communication, is that it is symbolic. We can use it to represent items that have never existed, never will exist, or that we've never seen, or ideas even, right? Even if another animal can communicate a specific way, there aren't many examples, or really any, of animals communicating ideas as opposed to having symbols that stand for objects or people or things like that. So again, differentiating between human communication and animal communication there. It's also going to be important to mention the number of languages that exist around the world. So it's all arbitrary, and so really that means an infinite number of sounds could mean the same thing or could stand or symbolize the same object or idea. So when you start thinking about language, it's important to realize that there are many, many languages in the world. There are somewhere between 6,000 or 7,000 different languages, and we tend to classify languages very broadly in terms of if they're mutually intelligible. So if I'm speaking English and someone is speaking French, we can't understand each other if we only have knowledge of our one language. So those would be separate languages. But if someone is speaking something very similar or something where we can understand each other easily, then those are not going to be considered individual languages. So it's kind of an broad way to think about it, but it helps us kind of start to classify what counts as language. And the more particulars about classifying what is language and what is a different language isn't really up for debate in this class, because that's more of a linguistic or a linguist place to make that decision or have that discussion. Really, we want to talk about how language and culture are connected. So that's really our focus, but I do want to point out to you that there are thousands and thousands of languages around the world, and they don't all function the same way, but they all are symbolic forms of communication, no matter how different from each other they may be, or the different purpose or function they have in a society. Okay, and then also your textbook points out that the majority of people use only a few languages, so Mandarin Chinese accounts for the majority of spoken language or languages spoken by individuals in the world. And so the majority of people are speaking the same languages, even though there are so many languages. And then I think the book says the bottom 5% of those languages with the least native speakers or fluent speakers is where we start to be concerned about losing languages or languages dying out. So that's just another place we can work as anthropologists or as a linguistic anthropologist, is in preserving those languages or encouraging those languages to be taught, learned, and continue to be lived. All right, so we're going to jump right in, starting with the differences between human language use and non-human primate and other animal communication forms. And then we'll continue through talking about how language is used in our culture and how culture and language are integrated. And we'll have a section in there where we talk about the structure of language and how language is built and formed.